Hello. Hi everyone. Say hi as you come on so I know who's here. Can you guys hear me okay? Hi Sarah. Hi Devin. Hey Erin. Hi, is it Andrea or Andrea? I have a friend who's Andrea, but I also know an Andrea. Sweet. Okay, we'll wait a minute or two to see if anyone else wants to hop on and then get started. Hi Robin. Andrea, cool, okay. The comments are a little lagged, so if I respond to something you said like 30 seconds ago, I apologize. Okay, so I'm gonna get started. First, I want to introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. My name is Kelly. I'm a certified running and ultra running coach. I've been running since 2008, I think, when I was in college. Um, I also am a climber and I strength train, so I'm a multi-sport athlete, which I think is really cool. And I like helping other multi-sport athletes. Um, in my day job, I'm a data scientist, so super nerd over here. And I have two cats that may or may not make an appearance tonight, so one is almost asleep right now and the other one's walking around, so we'll see. So today we're going to talk about base building and easy running. So first I'm curious, when you guys hear base building, what do you think of? Building up the miles, winter training, no races in mind. Yeah, so usually when people talk about base building, they're talking about when you are starting to train for a race maybe or coming into running, building up to a distance, yeah. Coming back from an injury, coming up from or back from a big break in running. Usually we're talking about developing your aerobic system and creating a foundation for increasing the intensity and mileage later as you start training for a race. Easy runs to build from. Yeah, exactly. So first, we are going to talk about kind of the science behind how our body gets energy for running, and then the adaptations that occur when we do develop our aerobic system, and then how to run easy. So why are we talking about the aerobic system? So this is the primary source of energy for most races, especially the longer runs. Ultras are, as I think most of you know, they are low intensity for a long amount of time. So you're mostly using your aerobic system as the energy source. And even in shorter races like 5Ks, you're running a lot faster, but when you're first starting your 5K, you're not quite using your anaerobic energy systems yet, so you are still using your aerobic system. So it's important for any distance to develop this system. So now we're going to dive in a little bit of science. We're not going to dive too deep, so it'll kind of be an overview, but kind of sciencey. So hopefully you guys will follow along. But first, we need to talk about how our muscles get energy. So if you remember from high school or maybe college, depending on your degree, ATP is necessary for energy production for our muscles. And there are two main ways that ATP is generated in our body, with or without oxygen. So if there is oxygen present, then the aerobic system uses that oxygen to generate ATP via the Krebs cycle. So basically, your heart pumps blood out with each beat. The capillaries in your blood carry oxygen to your muscles. Myoglobin gives that oxygen to the mitochondria from your blood, and the mitochondria in your cells convert carbs, fat, and protein into ATP via the Krebs cycle, which we're not going to go deep in, but that's just the cycle that occurs. And that's only if oxygen is present. And then ATP is broken down, and that is what creates energy for our muscles. And then the capillaries clear any waste. So if we improve our aerobic system, then we are improving our body's efficiency at using oxygen. So on the flip side, if there is not oxygen present, then the anaerobic system generates ATP without oxygen via the Cori cycle. So in your cells, lactate is continuously produced and used as fuel. But once you start running harder, then there comes a point, if any of you are familiar with tempo runs, this is the pace that I'm talking about. It's the point when you're producing more lactate than your cells are using and cleaning. So basically that's when your aerobic respiration can't keep up anymore. So lactate spills into your bloodstream and is shuttled to other parts of the body to be used for fuel. So then to get ATP, the lactate has to go to your liver and be converted into glucose and shuttled back to your muscles to be converted into ATP to be used for energy. So if you just think about it, the aerobic system that uses oxygen is all within the cell, and it's much quicker and it produces a lot more ATP than the anaerobic system. So this is the primary energy system we use when we're building our base, and this is what we're developing. And once you start running harder, that is not to say that that won't develop your aerobic system as well. Because at any point in time, it's not like your aerobic system shuts off and then your anaerobic takes over. But once you start running harder, then you are also working on improving your body's ability to utilize lactate or improving your VO2 max. And then once you start working on those goals, that takes away from working on your aerobic system. So it shifts the focus. So that's why we want to run easier to focus on building the aerobic system rather than the other two goals. And if at any point I say something confusing or you have a question, feel free to write it in the comments. Just interrupt me. We don't have to wait till the end to answer a question, so feel free. So then the next thing I want to talk about is the physiological adaptations that occur when we start developing our aerobic system and getting fitter. So most of them we won't be able to see with our eyes, but they are super substantial. So the first one is an increase in mitochondrial density. So as I just said, the mitochondria is what takes the oxygen from the blood and then generates ATP. So if we have more mitochondria, a denser amount of them, we can create more ATP, which is more energy for our muscles. And then the next adaptation is an increase in heart stroke volume. So the heart stroke volume is how much blood your heart pumps with each beat. So when we become more aerobically fit, our heart can pump more blood with each beat. So in order to deliver the same amount of blood, it doesn't have to work as hard, basically. And that's why, this is another adaptation later, but we see a decrease in resting heart rate because our heart doesn't have to work as hard. It can deliver the same amount of blood with less beats once we're fitter. So the next adaptation is an increase in capillary density. So the capillaries are what deliver the oxygen in the blood to the muscles and clear the waste away from the muscles. So if we have more capillaries, there will be more blood flow and more oxygen getting to our muscles and a quicker clearing of the waste. And then the final, I guess there's 2 more adaptations. The next one is an increase in myoglobin content in our muscle fibers, and the myoglobin is what transferred the oxygen from the blood to the mitochondria. So more of those, it means more oxygen for our muscles again. If you haven't caught on, this is the common theme. Better aerobic system, more oxygen to our muscles, more energy. So this also leads to a greater capacity to use fat for fuel and less reliance on blood glucose, which is really important, especially in ultras, because the blood glucose comes from carbs, which we don't store as much as fats in our body. So if we can utilize fat as fuel, then we will always have kind of a backup fuel source while we're running really far, which is great if you've ever had to fuel yourself on a long run and you get sick of eating. Not to say you should stop eating, but I think you guys know what I mean. So then the last 2 adaptations are ones that you can see. The first I already mentioned is the decrease in resting heart rate, and similarly you potentially could see a decrease in your working heart rate while you're exercising, depending on a lot of other factors. But in general, if you're running the same effort level and same pace and you're fitter, your heart rate should be lower. And the one I actually like better is you'll have a quicker heart rate recovery. So heart rate recovery is the number of beats that your heart rate drops 1 minute after you stop exercising. So as you get fitter, your heart rate will drop more beats in that minute. Or if you're looking at a certain number of beats from when you first started running, it will drop that same number of beats in a smaller amount of time when you're fitter. And I like to track those so you can see how you're progressing, even when, day to day sometimes you don't feel like you're progressing, but the greater picture says you are. So the next thing I want to talk about is what our goal should be while we are base building. So this is especially important for those of us who are coming back from an injury or from a long break from not running, and we're not used to the stress and the impact of running anymore, or if you're just starting running. Working up to running frequently and consistently is really important. Usually that's 4 to 6 times per week. I have my athletes aiming for 5 times per week, and then depending on how they feel on 5 times a week, we're going to adjust either up to 6 if they feel like they can handle more and want to, or down to 4 if it's a little too much. So a lot of this is individual and it requires you to be in tune with your body, but 4 to 6 times a week is kind of the recommendation that a lot of people go for. And this is so you can spread the load across the week. Hi, Chelsea! And it reduces your risk for injury and overtraining. So more frequent runs allows your body to adapt to the stress of running without putting too much stress on it at once. Because you don't only need to develop your cardiovascular system, you also need to allow your muscles, bones, tendons, ligaments, all of the structural features time to adapt to support the same level that your cardiovascular system is ready for. And one of my favorite quotes from Coach Jay Johnson is, "Metabolic fitness precedes structural readiness," which just means your cardiovascular system adapts way quicker than your physical body. So you need to be mindful of that and not do too much too soon just because you feel like, your lungs are ready for it, but maybe your shins are not. And that could lead to, shin splints or something like that. This also can apply if you go too fast on your easy days because that applies more stress to your body than an easier pace. And if you do that consistently across many days and many weeks, that will set you up for more risk for injury and overtraining. So I want to give you guys kind of an extreme example that will hopefully make this make sense. So let's say we have one person who is running 5 times per week and they're running 3 miles a day. So they have a pretty even load and they're all easy runs. And then we have another person who is running one 15-mile run every week and they're just running once a week. So these two people are running the same amount of volume, but as you can, I'm sure, imagine, the stress put on the person doing a 15-mile long run is a lot more than the person doing 3 miles each day, because the person doing 3 miles each, or 5 days a week, almost every day, they run for 3 miles, put some stress on their body gets a chance to adapt and recover before they run 3 miles again, and then it just kind of builds on itself. Versus the 15-mile run, you're just building all of that stress all at once, and your body doesn't have a chance to recover, and your structural or your musculoskeletal system might not be ready for that. And if you continually do that, you are at more chance for risk. And you won't adapt as quickly because you're running once and then taking 6 days off and then doing another running stimulus and 6 days off. And if you're like, wow, I never really thought that running frequently, consistently was that important, then you're not alone. Because I used to think that running fewer days but just increasing my long run was the best way to train for races, because then I could run fewer days and just keep increasing my mileage. But that's partially what I did in the fall, and then I got hurt. Not to say that was the only thing that caused me to get hurt, but I think it was a big factor because my weekday runs were pretty short, and then my long runs got up to 10 miles, so it was quite a stress on my body. So now that we know why we want to build our base and why we want to run frequently and consistently, now we can talk about how to run easy. So the most common way that I've heard to monitor your running to make sure you're going easy enough is heart rate training. So I'm curious if any of you have utilized heart rate training in your training before and how you liked it. Hi, Liz. Okay, Liz, how did you like heart rate training? Liz says she's used it. Yeah. Okay, Liz says it's up and down for me, can depend on the weather. Literally, southern heat can make it spike. Yeah, so heat does make your heart rate increase because it increases your body temperature. Okay, Aaron has measured heart rate following runs but never during. Robin, use run with how, which varies speed and duration. I think it's similar. Okay. Andrea, I try to look at my heart rate after runs, but haven't followed a plan specifically using heart rate. I like to use it for easy runs because sometimes I feel the pace is easy, but my heart rate tells me I'm lying. Yeah. So we're going to talk about that a little because sometimes your heart rate isn't lying, but we'll get into that in a second. So, okay, it looks like some of you have used heart rate training before and some of you have not. So if you are going to use heart rate training, most of the heart rate zones are based on either your max heart rate or your lactate threshold heart rate. So in order to do heart rate training, you need to know one of those two values. And if you remember from earlier, lactate threshold is the point at which more lactate is being produced than can be cleaned. And Devin said my heart rate is always high. If I did heart rate, I have to walk the entire time. Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way, honestly. Which, yeah, we're going to talk about pros and cons of heart rate training after we go through how to do it. So I am with you. So a lot of things I've read say using your lactate threshold heart rate is better than your max heart rate because it's easier to get that value. Because max heart rate, you'd have to push yourself basically to the brink, and a lot of people find that really hard. And it's very subjective whether you're actually going to your max or not. But so if you're doing lactate threshold heart rate, the most accurate way to get this is a lab test. So you do a treadmill test and someone will take a prick of your finger and test your blood lactate level and increase the speed every 2 minutes, I believe, and then they graph it, and wherever the lactate levels in your blood stop being linear and start being exponential is where your lactate threshold is. And they take your corresponding heart rate at each 2-minute interval, so that would give you the most accurate heart rate, since it would be your blood lactate levels. But most of us either don't want to do that, don't have access to that, or any of that. So the other option, which I think is a lot more common, is just to do a 30-minute time trial. And so when you're doing a 30-minute time trial, most people settle into a pace that they can hold for about an hour, and we are looking for your max lactate steady state, which is the highest intensity level at which your blood lactate concentrations are maintained at a steady level for an hour. So since you settle in at that hour-long pace, this is a pretty good indicator of your lactate threshold heart rate. So you run hard for 30 minutes and take the average heart rate of your last 20 minutes, and that's roughly your lactate threshold heart rate. And if you're like, Kelly, I don't want to do a 30-minute time trial. Well, most watches will estimate your lactate threshold heart rate, but as a lot of things that our watches measure, it's debatable how accurate it is, but it's probably a good starting point. So you could also start there. So I know my Coros watch does tell me what my supposed lactate threshold heart rate is. And if you really do want to try to find your max heart rate, there are those formulas that I'm sure everyone's heard of, 220 minus your age, all of those, but those are wildly inaccurate, so I would not recommend using those even as a starting point. But there are two other tests that I found that seem doable. So one is to find a pretty long hill, run up it hard for 2 minutes, take your heart rate, go back down, run up again, take your heart rate again, keep doing that until your heart rate does not increase anymore, and that's roughly your max heart rate. Or you could do a treadmill test similar to the lactate threshold treadmill test. Start out at a pretty easy pace, and then every 2 minutes increase the miles per hour by half mile per hour or 1 mile per hour, and just go until you can't anymore, which to me sounds miserable, but if you really want to, that would probably work. So then once you have these values, your easy running ranges should be around either 60 to 75% of your max heart rate or 75 to 85% of your lactate threshold heart rate. And a lot of online calculators will calculate this for you, because once you start doing other runs like tempo runs and intervals, there are other heart rate zones that you'd be looking to hit. I'm sure everyone is, or most people are familiar with the zone 1 is recovery, zone 2 is easy, zone 3 is moderate, zone 4 like sub threshold, zone 5 after threshold, and then maximum. So online calculators will give you that. Joe Friel is a common calculator that I've seen used a lot, and Training Peaks, which is the app I use with my athletes, will calculate this for you. And then whenever they upload a run, it tells me how long they spent in each zone, which can be useful, but as we're about to talk about, there are many cons with heart rate training. So first I want to start with the pro. The big pro I can think of is that it's a concrete metric that you can track and get immediate feedback from. So at any point in your run, you can look at your watch and see your heart rate and be like, oh, I'm working harder than I should, or oh, I'm working just as hard as I should, or I need to go faster, you know? And especially for data people like me, it's nice to have something concrete that tells me how I'm doing. But as, let's see, Andrea said, sometimes heart rate, well, Andrea said heart rate tells her that she's lying, but sometimes I think heart rate is lying. So let me tell you why. Most of us, if we are monitoring our heart rate on a run, we're using our watches. And wrist-based heart rate sensors are notoriously unreliable. So your heart rate reading at any given time on a run, if it's from your wrist, is possibly inaccurate. And this is especially true if it's cold out and for us women, because a lack of blood flow to our hands creates a lower heart rate than in reality. So one time this past summer, I was running on a trail up a 13er, which is a 13,000 foot peak, if you're not from Colorado and familiar with that term. So I was running, it was in June, it was kind of cold, but I got really hot because, you know, running up a mountain is hard. So I was just out in my tank top, and I had to walk at one point because it got a little steep. So I looked down at my heart rate just to see like how high it was, because I felt like I was dying, and my heart rate was like 88 beats per minute. You're not working hard at all. So, and I was like, I'm literally dying right now going up this mountain. There's no way my heart rate is 88. So just an example, your heart rate can lie to you. There's also something called cardiac drift, and that's when your heart rate naturally rises due to a rise in your body temperature, or when your muscles get tired but your effort level does not increase. So as like, for example, in a long run, if you feel like you are running the same effort level for the whole time and you're out there for 2 hours, but towards the end your muscles get really tired, your heart rate could increase just because your muscles are tired. And with that, some other factors that affect heart rate, heat, as Liz mentioned earlier, heat will make your heart rate rise. Caffeine and other stimulants, so if you're a morning runner and you just drink your coffee and then go running, but you're trying to hit certain heart rate zones, your heart rate might be artificially elevated just due to the caffeine, not due to how hard you're working. In race scenarios, when you get really excited or nervous, that can make your heart rate increase and not necessarily mean that you're working too hard yet. Same if you are stressed, having an emotional response to life, you're upset, or maybe really happy. It could go either way. your hydration status. If you're dehydrated, your heart rate could be higher. Elevation, if you've ever gone to altitude, you know that you only have to take 2 steps and your heart rate is through the roof, even though you're still walking, you know. And then the interesting one is fatigue actually usually lowers your heart rate. And as we'll talk about tomorrow when we talk about overtraining, that can be one of the signs that you are getting to be or are overtraining. If you're running the same run and pace and effort level that you usually do, but your heart rate is much, much lower, that can be a sign. So, with all of that being said, if you really do want to do heart rate training, it can be better if you use a chest strap because that would be much more accurate because that spot has a lot more blood flow constantly while you're running and it's much closer to your heart. So I would recommend that if you do want to do heart rate training, just to have some concrete numbers. But the method that I like better, or the method you can pair with heart rate training, is the rate of perceived exertion scale, or the talk test. So when most people talk about easy running, they're talking about the pace at which you could hold a conversation with someone. So this is the talk test. Like, can you hold a conversation at this pace? A good way to test this is to go running with a friend and talk to them the whole time. Or if you like to run alone, you could call someone, talk to them on the phone. Or you could just talk to yourself. But if you're going to talk to yourself, I would say repeat a lengthy phrase or something like the Pledge of Allegiance maybe a couple times on your run. Since it is a conversational pace, you want to make sure that you're not mistaking a slightly harder run where you can only speak 2 to 3 sentences for an easier run where you could recite like the whole Pledge of Allegiance, if that makes sense. So then with that, for the rate of perceived exertion scale, there are different types of easy running. And this also goes into what we're talking about tomorrow with tempo runs and intervals. Those are at the high end of the RPE scale. But the lowest one is recovery runs. So those, it should be very easy for you to speak. And your breathing rate should be comfortable, barely above your walking breathing rate. These should be short runs, usually 20 to 60 minutes. They're an RPE of 4 to 5. And like their name suggests, their main goal is recovery or keeping your muscles loose. So these could be used on a rest day as active rest, but I would say be careful there because rest days are very important and you don't want to slack on a rest day just to get in a recovery run, especially because I think, speaking from my experience, running at this easy of a pace is very hard. I don't know if you guys agree, but yeah, breathing rate barely above walking. I don't think I've ever gone on a run that easy. So the next level is our conversational pace. These are called endurance runs, which is what most people think of when they think easy running. And as the name suggests, the goal is to develop your endurance. So these are really important for ultras. They are low intensity for a long amount of time. And they are an RPE of 5 to 6. Your breathing rate should be moderate and not labored. And they can last anywhere from 30 minutes to 6+ hours. So this is usually when you're racing an ultra, the pace that you settle into over time. So then there's one more kind of run that could be qualified as easy running since it's still below your threshold, and those are called steady state runs. Those are an RPE of 7 and you can speak 2 to 3 sentences at a time, which is why when we were talking about conversational pace and I was saying if you're just repeating something to yourself out loud, make sure it's a longer phrase or Pledge of Allegiance, because steady state runs are slightly harder than endurance runs, and they're just a little harder than you want to be doing for your normal easy runs. But their goal is developing aerobic fitness, so you're going a little harder than your endurance pace, but a little easier than your tempo pace, which we'll get into more tomorrow. And with this one, your breathing starts to get deep and labored, and these are usually done in intervals and not fast intervals like you might have thought when I said that word, because that's the common conception with intervals. But so you usually do 20 to 60 minutes per interval, and then in one workout, the time at the steady state intensity should be anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours. So an example workout or run with that would be you're going for a 2-hour endurance run, which remember is our easier pace than steady state. And then in the middle of that endurance run, you'll have 2 by 30 minutes at steady state with 5 minutes between those intervals. So as you can see here, we're mixing two kinds of easy runs, but one is working on our endurance and one is more aerobic fitness, but they're both still on the easier side. So the one thing I want to say about the RPE scale is it requires you to be honest with yourself. So you have to be honest on how deep is your breathing. Can you actually hold a conversation? Is your RPE lower than a 7, Because if you're not honest with yourself, you could be like, yeah, I'm running an RPE 4, but meanwhile, you're not going super easy. And another way to tell if you're going easy enough is when you finish a run that's an easy run, you should feel like you could keep going for a while. So if you feel like if you went for another quarter or half mile and you'd be dead, then you're going too hard. Or if you feel completely wiped after you're done, you're probably going too hard. So now that we know how we should do easy running, how do we know when our aerobic system is getting fitter? There are 3 ways that I usually look at. 2 we've already talked about, so we're just going to revisit them. The one is your resting heart rate upon waking as you get more, as your base is better. Yeah, Emery, it is hard to be honest with yourself and go slow. I think it's really hard to force yourself to slow down, but you can also view it as good mental training, because I've heard a lot of people say they don't want to go on easy runs because, it's so slow and it's so boring, but that will develop your mental toughness, and especially if you're training for an ultra, once you hit a certain point, you're going to need some mental toughness, and that will only serve you later. So if you can force yourself to slow down now, I promise it'll help. So back to how we tell if our aerobic capacity is increasing. Resting heart rate will be lower as we get fitter. Recovery heart rate, our heart rate will drop the same amount of beats in less time after we stop, or it'll drop more beats in 1 minute as we get fitter. And then the last one is your pace at the same effort level should get quicker. So you'll be able to run faster at the same RPE as when you started your base building, which is pretty cool. So now I have a couple questions that some of you gave to me before this live, and so I'm going to go over those, and then if you guys have any questions, put them in the chat and I'll answer them too. So the first one was from Stephanie. She said, how to avoid shin splints while building your base. So my first inclination is to ask Stephanie a bunch of questions. I'd want to know your running history. Have you had shin splints before? What did your training look like leading up to the injury? Did you go to a PT to treat it? All of that stuff. I don't know if Stephanie's here, but Stephanie, if you're here, give me some more background on this. But other than that, shin splints are usually an overuse injury, as are many of our running injuries that we get. And this usually comes from ramping up our intensity and or mileage too fast, too soon. So one thing is to make sure you have a gradual increase of intensity and mileage. And if you are prone to shin splints, I think as you're building your base, it could be beneficial to use run-walk intervals instead of straight runs. So instead of like running for 30 minutes, maybe running 5 minutes, walking 5 minutes, doing that until you reach 30 minutes total. So that'll lessen the impact and the usage of your tibialis anterior, which is the muscle next to your shin, which can cause shin splints. And then other than that, doing cross-training with running can be helpful because cross-training can help build your cardiovascular system if you like biking or something like that. And also strength training can help a lot with a lot of our running injuries. But yeah, other than that, I would need more specifics, and I'm also not a doctor, so I think a physical therapist would be very beneficial in one of these situations. So the next question is from Dre. She asked how to figure out the right mileage. So this is another thing that depends. It depends on the person. It depends on your running background, your injury history, the time you have available to train, your goal, your other priorities in life. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's big that would affect it. I'm sure there are. There are lots of factors that go into the right mileage, and it'll be different for each person. Some people can handle much higher mileage and never get injured or overtrained, and then other people hit that point at a lower mileage than they want, and it's kind of just trial and error sometimes. But one thing I do want to mention is instead of worrying about the right mileage, I like to think, especially if you're trail running, think more about time on feet, because so let's say you're doing a 10-mile run. If you were doing that 10-mile run on a road, that would take a lot less time than if you're doing that 10-mile run on a trail. And since those times differ so much, the stress on your body is not the same for those two runs. So the trail run is going to be more stressful than the road run because you're on your feet for longer. And I think a lot of people don't take that into consideration, and that can also lead to overtraining and injury, because we often think just in mileage, but there's a lot more to this story. But long answer short, it depends. And then the last question I have, also from Dre, she asked pros and cons of running 7 days a week versus 4 to 6 days a week, assuming 80% easy effort. So if you do this right, a very easy run can be considered active recovery. For a rest day, like we talked about before, the recovery run does exist. But like I said, I haven't encountered a lot of people that can force themselves to run as slowly as is required for a true active recovery run and or as short. Because remember, those runs aren't long. Their goal is to keep your muscles loose without putting extra stress on your body. So it's not going out for like an hour easy run. And then the most obvious con for this situation is you have no rest days, Rest days are really important, I think, especially as we get older. your body needs a chance to recover, and sometimes your mind needs a chance to recover. Mentally, running every day can get very, very tiring. And I did do this in college, so I can't really poo poo it too much, but I was not the healthiest person in college, so I did survive, but I would not recommend it. Rest days are really good. They help you not overtrain, they help you not get injured. The guideline is to have one full rest day every 7 to 14 days. And by full rest day, we mean no intense activity. So if any of you guys are like me, I know Emery is. Sometimes I would say that I was gonna go climb on my rest day, but depending on the wall I'm climbing on, if it's steep, that's not a rest day, because then I'm still gonna be sore from that, and my body's gonna be tired. So yeah, full rest days, very important, but you could technically do it every other week. The one thing I want to say about that is I found that a planned rest day really helps, like planning for Monday, for example, to be your rest day, because we are creatures of habit and you will get used to that, and you might even start to look forward to it. Hi, Pumpkin. Sorry, my cat is trilling at me right now. He wants attention. Yeah, and I've also found, so I am currently not being coached by anyone right now, and due to that, I give myself the liberty of moving around my rest day as much as I want, but I try to plan it for one day. But the problem with that is if you let yourself just move it and you're like, okay, I'll take one every 7 to 14 days. Yes, Liz, intense climb days are not rest days. So if you tell yourself you're going to take a rest day every 7 to 14 days, and then let's say your rest day comes, you're like, I feel fine, I'm not going to take a rest day, and then you do that week after week. If you don't keep track of it, eventually you're not going to have a rest day for like a month, and that's not ideal. So I find planning one each week is really helpful. And then if you are really good at being honest with yourself, then you could do an audit of your body on your rest day and be like, I think I can handle this amount of effort for this activity. Like maybe go for a really easy bike ride, or you could do an easy climb day, but most of us climbers are not good at that. So with that, those are all the questions that I have pre-given to me. If you guys have any questions, okay, Erin. When you cross train, do you still run on those days? I'm trying to balance mountaineering with running. I find it hard to find balance in scheduling. So, yeah, I personally usually end up running with cross training, just because of how my schedule is too. So, my plan is usually I lift twice a week. I usually try to run on those days too, just so that I can get a rest day in, especially because I know 2 other days I'm probably climbing, and one of those is going to be with a run as well. So like a sample week for me is Monday, run and lift, Tuesday, rest, Wednesday, run and lift, Thursday, run, Friday, climb, Saturday and Sunday, sometimes I interchange, but one is running, my long run, and one is a shorter run with climbing. So I could probably talk about this forever, and maybe I think in the future I'll probably have another live about multi-sport scheduling. But what I find to be the best way for me to make my schedule, or a schedule for any of my athletes, is you put in the activities that are your top priority first. So for me and for most of my athletes, that's running. So we put in all of our running days. Those are kind of non-negotiables, so they have to be in our schedule. And then right now for me, my second priority is lifting. So then my lifting days go in. And then I look at my schedule, and on any remaining days, I put in my climbing. And the important thing is once I get to my climbing days, if I feel too exhausted, I'm going to cut out the climbing. But I'm going to keep the running as much as I can because that's my top priority. Does that help? And if anyone else has questions, now is the time. Good. I'm glad, Erin. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions about anything we went over today or really anything that comes to mind right now? Tomorrow we are going to talk about adding intensity and mileage and how to know if you're overtraining because they all kind of go hand in hand. Thanks for coming, Devin. I'm so glad that all of you guys came. This was my first live ever, so I'm glad nothing happened that was bad. You know, like technical issues or my cat's knocking everything over. Okay, Emery, oh, thanks, Sarah. So, Emery said, how do you know when you've built a good base for longer mileage? So, basically, the resting heart rate, your recovery heart rate, and once your pace at the same effort level starts to get quicker, then you know your aerobic capacity is increasing. And from that point, you can start to try adding in intensity and mileage. Usually, the base building phase, depending on your background, lasts anywhere from like 4 to 10 weeks. So, okay. So usually I would do looking at how long you've been in your base phase and looking at those 3 metrics to see when to know to start increasing your mileage more. Because in your base phase, you'll probably increase your mileage a little bit, but nothing too crazy. Nothing like when you're training for your first 50K. So Andrea, a good base for running in your 50K. So I am actually starting to train for a 50K as well, and I'm in my base building phase. So I would say for your first 50K, work up to running 5 times a week if your body feels okay, and then keep track of those 3 metrics and see when they start improving, and combine that with the length you've been doing it. And it's kind of a lot of trial and error, and I don't mean that in a bad way by any means. It's you start increasing your mileage or adding an intensity, and then you take an audit of how you're recovering, how you're feeling going into your next run, and then based on that, you know if you're pushing it too hard, and you should like back up, maybe back to your base workouts and mileage or time. Does that help? I think if you're running your first 50K and you've been in your base phase for like 6 to 8 weeks, that should be a good base. That's a very generalized answer, but I think most people would be in a good place after that amount of time. Okay. And just adding on to that, it's hard to say what a good base would be for someone running their first 50K without knowing you individually and what you've been doing and all of that, you know? So a lot of my answers will be it depends. I need to know you as an individual, but hopefully those general answers give you a place to start. Does anyone else have any questions before we drop off for the night? All right. Well, thank you all for coming to my first successful live, and hopefully I will see you all tomorrow. And if you have any questions about adding intensity, mileage, or overtraining, I'll put a post in that event so you can drop your questions there, or same as tonight, just hop on live and I will answer them to the best of my ability on the spot. Yay! Well, have a great night, everyone. This was so fun. Thanks for coming. Bye, guys.